And blow this up a little bigger, make it a little smaller. Dial in what we got here today. Today is an exciting day for us because we probably will touch ground that is not familiar to you. So that is always good. And get my links up here. Going to be exciting. Wow, it's really noisy. Okay, so today I wanted to talk about the 1970s a bit, like the late 1960s and the 1970s. So we've approached that from a few angles now. We went from the experimental film track, and that led us all the way up to John Whitney, who started working with computers, which was kind of a foreshadowing beyond where we'll be today. But John Whitney's work with analog computers or machines is actually also influential, what we'll talk about today. And additionally, we went through like this graphic score route, which showed that on the audio end of things or on the music side of things, there is also a push to go cross-modal. And so what happens in the 60s that's really important is the combining of media at the electrical or the analog basis. So here's what I mean. And bear with me while I get the whiteboard up and try to draw with the trackpad. So we had, in the beginning, we had two things that kind of combined at a basis. So this is the basis. And these are the two things. So the basis here would have been the optical soundtrack. I'm just going to say optical film, opt film. And we had sound and image, moving image. I'm just going to call it moving image because this is really hard to draw. Moving image and sound meet at this basis. And what I mean by that is that they're actually on the same medium, right? So as Oscar Fischinger showed, to work with image is to work with sound if you put it on the sound track. Or you could put the soundtrack on the visual film and you would be able to see it. So what does this imply, right? It implies that things could just go on their merry way if we imagine this as being the past. And this being the future. Then this comes from something called the Minkowski time cone, which is not something you will study in music school, except for today. And so this is the possible future and this is the possible past, right? So from the possible pasts, we have arrived at this basis, right? And then from there, we can go to the possible futures if nothing changes. But arriving at this basis should have implications. We are converging upon the basis and we can diverge from the basis having pretended that nothing happened. So sound could not change and moving images could not change. But instead, what we kind of got was this transvergence, or this move away from what was the projected future into a new future. And so that sort of became this sort of combined visual music film, right? So we have this sort of AV film, we'll call it. So we have Norman McLaren, Oscar Fischinger, Mary Ellen Brute, all these different figures that start working out in an entirely new genre, really. So genres of the past that were influenced by that it wasn't really in the possible future necessarily until this basis combined the two. So now what we're looking at is we've got AV film. And we've got, let's say, I'm just going to say control voltage or parametric control. How do you put this? I'm going to call this parametric composition. Parametric. My God. There's no way I'm spelling out composition. Comp. And those two things are going to kind of combine. And I stretched that a little bit. I can't really think of a good thing for this other route, but it's there somewhere. Maybe we could say this is, let's say this is analog audio synthesis, right? So what I mean by the parametric composition is that with the introduction of analog synthesizers, and really with the introduction of the idea from the serialists that we could control all parameters in some serial way, so treating music as a set of parameters to which we give information so that they change over time in some structured way. So this basis here becomes voltage or electricity, or we'll just say analog, because that's what we're familiar with. So an analog of these things. So an analog represented in electricity of the visual, and an analog of the parametric composition of the musical, so it's sort of the control voltages. And sort of the question becomes, all right, well, these are the possible pasts and the possible futures. What is this trajectory, right? So this actually becomes sort of this AV, audiovisual, video art. Got a lot quieter in here. Can you guys still hear me? Yeah. AV video art. And this is kind of what we're going to talk about today. Now, obviously, as we go along, this little graph continues, right? And so you might imagine what has happened, at the late 20th century, and then trying to imagine what this might be right now is quite a challenge. But this is a good simple model, the Minkowski time cone as applied to art, to figure out what happens when things converge at a basis. So to me, the electrical basis, the analog basis was a big one. And obviously the digital basis also became a big thing. And the basis is just something where we share representation with other disciplines. So we are sharing, in this case, electricity. An audio signal and a video signal are made of the same stuff, just electrical voltages. Okay. Any questions about what I just talked about there? Any comments? Okay. All right, so who are the audio visual video artists out there? Who did this and how did it come about? Well, I think we're more familiar with the Moog method of working, right? Where we have a Moog synthesizer, and Moog came out with his first commercial synthesizer in 1964. So the Moog synthesizer allowed for voltage control of pitch and timbre and all sorts of things, right? Before that, it was at the universities, so big synthesizers like the RCA Mark II at the Columbia Princeton Music Studios allowed you to do any sort of musical thing you wanted with parametric control. So if you had some crazy rhythm you wanted to hear, the machine would play it for you, right? It was an analog synthesizer, so it made synthesized tones. The tones could be constructed to an extent, and the parameters all controlled with voltage. So there's another sort of combining of things at a basis. Actually, the method of control is the same as the audio production, right? So the audio is voltage, and the controls to control the music are also voltages. And I think we're kind of familiar with analog synthesis, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, except to say that it had a large influence on video art. So video art being distinguished from experimental film in that now we're dealing with real-time construction. So as the synthesizers of Moog and Buchla, for instance, take us out of the studio with electronic music. So now it's out on the stage, it can be done live, it's improvisational. So it becomes for video. So film being a almost necessarily non-real-time adventure, video is a real-time adventure. And so we have this really interesting set of circumstances where we have real-time synthesis of video and real-time synthesis of audio, both occurring at the same time. And so you might imagine that there were people that took advantage of that. So around 1968 or 69, there was this, and this is all going to happen around the Northeast, around New York. So now actually the center of this activity, when we think of video, we're going to think New York City, Chicago, Boston, as opposed to film, where we've been thinking Hollywood, LA, San Francisco. So now we're shifting to the East Coast. And on the East Coast, there's an artist named Namjoon Paik, who you should know. But if you don't, his last name is spelled P-A-I-K. So Namjoon Paik is invited along with several other artists to do a presentation or an exhibition at a gallery, the Howard Wise Gallery in New York. And that presentation is about TV as a creative medium. So if you can imagine for a second that TV is not a creative medium, that TV is just a way to deliver images to people conveniently, at the time, 1968, people are starting to think that maybe the medium is the message, is what Marshall McLuhan says. So how do we use this medium itself as the inspiration for new art? Hey, Fran. And so around that time, there's a lot of artists that come in. Namjoon Paik is making these big TV sculptures. You've probably seen them. Well, in the early days of MTV, they were all over the place as sort of the inspiration. So these sculptures that Namjoon Paik would create out of TVs. But he also made sort of video transformations that would take his image and project it onto the TV the wrong way. You know, so you're looking at yourself, but you have been transformed in the TV to be three of you of different colors, for instance. So kind of messing with television circuits in a way so that there's a real-time camera view of you displayed, but it's transformed. So another way that he did that was to put horseshoe magnets on top of TVs, which would bend the image. So if you can find an old CRT and a big old magnet, you can try that yourself. But he decided that that was a little less than desirable. So he invited Shunya Abe, an engineering friend of his, and they built the first sort of video synthesizer. And I think that's debatable about whether it's the first, but around 1968, there is a video synthesizer that bends the image and can change the colors. So let's take a look at something simple. We'll take a look at this Howard Wise gallery exhibition. And okay, I clicked on the wrong link, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'll share the screen and we're gonna, Alex is gonna be okay. Share the screen and we're gonna watch what I just talked about with Namjoon Paik, just to see what things were like in 1968. So here's sharing the screen. Here we go. Okay, are you guys seeing this?
Yeah, flash light. How you can have a flat light? How we can do that for us?
Or you can control higher beam but let's change the angle.
We have to have a higher end. This comes out.
What did you say, Ira? Floodlight instead of the
Okay, so there's a lot of chaos there. Alex knows about that because he just did an installation. So, you can imagine there's this sort of technological craziness going on. And this is actually a pretty big event. It's pretty inspiring for people. So there's lots of people that met at this event. And actually, Howard Wise would go on to sell the gallery and start his own company for the purpose of promoting video art. So it kind of sprang from this. And from that company, actually, there's lots of artists that we'll look at. So namely, two of the early video synthesizers, Eric Siegel and Namjoon Paik, met at this gallery event. So let's look at what else was happening at this gallery event just to inform ourselves a little bit. So there's this spirit in the air of the time of the counterculture. So if you can think of, people what do they say? Tuning in and dropping out, that sort of thing. The Beatles are going through their sort of psychedelic transformation. People at Kent State are going to be shot this year. It's a turbulent, crazy time, a watershed year, and TV is transforming too. So here we go. Let's take a look at Eric Siegel's 1968 Tomorrow Never Knows. So this is the Beatles tune Tomorrow Never Knows, and Eric Siegel has made a video rendition of it using a custom-built colorizer. Okay, so there's some weird images that no one had ever seen before. Still a little bit primitive, really, but this becomes inspirational for people. There are some other works from that event, but I will skip them now and let you look at those on your own time. So as a tie to some artists we're going to return to briefly, and one of the first programs championed by Howard Wise in his manifesto, At the Leading Edge of Art, Valsuka video was one of his early things he supported. And so Valsuka is Woody and Stena Valsuka, who are video artists we're going to look at pretty shortly, who combine sound and image in this analog medium to great effect, and should be for us quite in line with this narrative we're trying to trace. So just so you know a little bit about them, they conducted research into the development of special video tools, experimented with the production of devices that allowed them to directly manipulate the electronic signal. And through their experimentation with electronic sound and image, the Valsukas expanded the technical vocabulary of the medium and inspired a generation of emerging artists. As original members of the collective Perceptions and co-founders of The Kitchen, the Valsukas conducted workshops and created a laboratory environment for artists to explore the evolving language of video. So if you don't know, The Kitchen is a huge place for new music and new art, located in New York City, but now they have The Kitchen in LA and other places as well. So that is a foundational element of American culture for experimental image and sound. In a major development for our particular pursuit, we have the development of the Sandine image processor by one of my favorite people in the world, Dan Sandine, who I would love to meet him because he's the coolest. So Sandine made this image processor, which is a video synthesizer, and he specifically used the Moog synthesizer as not only inspiration, but like technically, how do I do this? So he had no real training in designing circuits. He said, I used to put together TVs and stuff, or radios, used to put together radios so he could do popular mechanics sort of circuits. So he just copy them out of the magazine, but he had no idea how to make anything. But that didn't stop him from making this extremely influential Sandine image processor, which he also made at the time, it's very unusual, open source. So he said, here's all the way, this is how you make it, here you go, and other people made it, right? So one of the people he worked with at the EVL, the Electronic Visualization Laboratory at the University of Chicago, University of Illinois at Chicago. One of the people he worked with there, Phil Morton, actually made the first copy of the IP, and then those plans were sent out to the West Coast. So you can find video at UC Santa Cruz, for instance, of people using the Sandine image processor. But I'm going to let Dan Sandine explain the image processor for you, because he does a good job. The audio engineer in you will note the amazing mic technique he is using. So let me find it here. All right, so here is Dan Sandine's explaining his image processor. Let me make sure I did this share right. I did. Okay.
Whoa! Hey, wait. You see this? How much weight is it? A lot of it. One. Actually, not right now. I gotta save it. Yeah.
A 5-minute romp through the image processor. The function is not to explain it carefully enough so one would be able to walk up to it and use it. There'll be lots of details ignored. But by explaining it to some degree of detail to give a concept of how it works. First of all, it's a compact way of saying what it is to say that it is a general purpose analog computer, a general purpose patch programmable, meaning programmed by patch cables, analog computer, analog to distinguish it from what is normally called a computer, which is a digital computer, which is the kind of thing that does your bills and payrolls and does information storing and retrieval and stuff like that. This is another breed of computer entirely called an analog computer. And it's optimized. What makes it different than most general purpose analog computers is that this one is optimized for processing video information, for processing television information, although it also can process sound or any other signal within some restrictions. For instance, the comparator, which is this unit here, I'm now running a signal from the camera input into the comparator and then into this output module. And if I switch to the process signal, you see something like a codolith turned all black and white, except that I can very easily adjust the gray level at which that transition is made. Now that's one primitive processing step. Another primitive processing step is the function generator, which I will transfer to now. And with that, you see I can adjust the continuous transfer gray levels. There's the white area, middle gray area, and black area, and produce effects that are like solarization, but somewhat more complicated. The value scrambler, which is this module here, I'm patching in here and out here, and I'll turn to that process. What that does is divide the value region up into 8 separate value regions, and I have independent control out of each one of those value regions. I'm going down now and adjusting them from white to black, or playing with them from white to black. This module, like other modules, the knobs also can be done by control voltage, which allows for a more complex interaction. There are several other modules which I'm going to skip over very quickly, one of which is the adder multiplier, and this allows for very simple combinations of images. For instance, I can use it, for instance, to fade from one image to another. But because these are also voltage controllable, I can have that function performed by control voltage, which presently is being generated up here by an oscillator, and I can vary the frequency that that kind of thing happens. I also can generate standard special effects, as I call them, like this is, for instance, a key. And they all can be generated with this adder multiplier, which is kind of a ubiquitous utility module. It allows combining signals in both simple and complex ways. Turn your sets to color now. Of more snapshots, more or less, of what I've been up to with the color IP since the color IP was finished, if it's finished, and since it was finished in color, since the color modules were added at the end of the summer. They're mostly little snapshots, kind of extractions of experiments. I haven't yet gotten had an excuse or wanted to put together a kind of complete entity.
Okay, so that was Sandine's image processor. He's an interesting guy. You'll notice he had the microphone strapped around his neck like a necklace. I really like that. So how did he end up where he was?
Well, what was that hat, by the way? That was just ironic. He was.
He wears those kind of hats all the time. He wears like Viking helmets. Weird.
Well, now this pushes to a subject that we've been tiptoeing around in this class and Harwood's class. At some point, drugs have got to become a major part of this culture, right? Especially in the West Coast, maybe not this East Coast, but realistically, they're probably hanging out with like Aldous Huxley at this point, you know, like.
Well, I don't know that. You know, I haven't found any documentation that says that, but I think that, you know, I think Morton Subotnick said something like LSD was falling from the skies like manna. So, you know, Morton Subotnick being a West Coast electronic musician. But it's not clear to me, you know, we can make assumptions, but, you know, Dan Sandine has never made a statement to that effect. So we just don't know. But there does seem to be, so he says about the, I don't know if I have the quote, but, you know, when you read interviews with him, he says, you know, that he's making this thing so that people can find, you know, religious experiences, so forth and so on through it. And actually what's happening that I think is probably more profound is that Dan Sandine, Woody Vasulka, all of these people working in this particular element are looking for ways that we can sort of artfully explain computers. So what is a computer in an experiential way? Right? What is that? And so that becomes a really interesting sort of idea, is that especially when we see our own images, because Dan Sandine does this over and over again when he produces things, and it's actually a famous video now. So there's a longer romp through the IP where they take his video and again manipulate it. And so what happens is seeing ourselves or our images inside these screens and then being manipulated by the computer. And we'll look at this next week with a guy named Kruger. He explains it pretty well, that this is an experiential connection with computing, or you know, with media. So it's art in the truest sense of, you know, experiential. I think you're probably right that there is some exploration of consciousness there that maybe ties into the drug culture, because it's, you know, late 1960s, and that's a thing that it's hard for us to view, I think, in the correct way. I don't know what the correct way is, but we view it through a lens, through a filter of it was in the past. So it's hard to know what it was like to be alive then.
And then also too, like we haven't seen it very much political works, but I feel like, especially with the visual element, that would be, I guess it's beyond representation is why maybe it's not so political, but like I just would expect a ton of political content.
Well, you know, in an interview with Sandine, what's interesting is they're trying to pinpoint when things happen, and he relates it all to political events. He's like, well, the Cambodian crisis, you know, when was that? It was 68. He says, okay, well, 68 then, you know, and with the Kent State shooting, like 68, right? So it's definitely in the air. But I think what I've seen from Sandine, and we'll see some of the other things here, is more of is not very political. I think there's an avoidance of that, which sometimes is a good idea, because politics lose their reference point, right? So it's hard to look back at a piece from 2004 about George Bush and really feel like it's a timeless work, right? It's pretty lodged in how things felt then. So for instance, 2016, you know, was a time when people felt some type of way all over the place, but it's gonna be really hard to pinpoint that feeling. But maybe some artworks will do that, but they're gonna feel a little bit pedantic, I think. So there's an avoidance of that, in my opinion, not by anything I've read anybody say, but their works do tend to be non-representational. So how did Sandine end up in a college professor position, which is interesting because in his interviews, he just kind of acts like, well, he said he sent out 200 letters to art departments all over the United States and said he was a physicist who doesn't know what he's doing with art, can he work there? And somehow he got the job, but that's not quite how it happened. So in 1969, before this image synthesizer, but while it's in his mind, he developed a computer-controlled light and sound environment called GlowFlow at the Smithsonian Institution and was invited to join the art faculty at the University of Illinois in the same year. So he did have some big major success that led him to join the faculty there. So he worked with Tom DeFonte to combine the image processor with real-time computer graphics. So now we're going to see sort of a hybrid, which is very common in the 70s, to start having computer control of analog things, which gives you a little bit more precision. So in 1991, Sandin and DeFonte conceived and developed in collaboration with graduate students the K Virtual Reality Theater. So we can see that this video art that we're seeing from 1973 and on leads us directly to virtual worlds and where we are today. And so some of the earliest research into that is being conducted at the EVL in Chicago with Dan Sandine, who we're looking at right now. So I wanted to, and I've left some links in the notes. I don't think I want to go through them now, but they are sort of detailed notes about what exactly are all those modules and what do they do. But I'll let you explore that on your own time because we will run out of time. What I wanted to look at was a work by Sandine called Spiral 5, I think it is. And I think it's Spiral 5 PTL, which means perhaps the last. And so this comes out of work that they were doing in the 70s. So I think this is 78. So they've been at it for a minute. But they would have concerts where people would have analog synthesizers and they would have their video synthesizers, analog audio synthesizers, and they would have their video synthesizers. And they would make real-time live music. This piece, I have a feeling, was put together a little more carefully than that. But it is an amazing work. And so we'll watch the whole thing. So this uses Sandine's image processor and his coworker DeFonte's GRASS program, G-R-A-S-S, it stands for something, on a PDP-11, which is an old computer, along with real-time analog synthesizers. So I'm excited to watch this again because it's super cool work and looks really quite amazing. So I will dial it up here and then I'll share the screen. If it'll let me, there we go. Okay, so here is Spiral 5, Dan Sandine, Spiral 5 PTL. And here we see it's computer graphics, Tom DeFonte, video synthesis, Dan Sandine, and the sound synthesis is Mimi Shevitz. And even though it says copyright 1981, this piece was first done, I think, in 78. Okay, so there's that piece. Really forward looking. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
That was really cool, honestly.
Holy shit, Nate.
I was thinking about what you mentioned on people trying to show in an artistic way what a computer does.
Yeah, and people's experience with computers, especially at that point, is really what he said. Like, we're going to do the payroll with them. It's going to make our lives so much easier, right? Really, and really not seeing sort of the fundamental way it's going to alter our lives totally, you know, uh, completely. And the experiences we have now are, I mean, here we are. I mean, this experience is different, right? It's part of our human existence now. And I think it's a pretty fascinating way to show it. And I really think that work holds up extremely well. It's hard to find works that hold up quite as well as that one does, although there are a few from around 1976 or so. And one of the more common pieces of equipment, in addition to Sandines, but probably the most popular piece of equipment, becomes the Rut-Etra synthesizer, which you can see in lots of different works. But the people that are probably the most well known for using it are the Vasulkas, who I mentioned earlier, so Woody and Steina. And meeting at the analog domain, they do visual and sound things. So sound becomes their source. They visualize things. Visual things turn back into sound. Sound is used, like sound generating waveform generators are used as parametric controls. So here is where we run into something that's really an interesting blend of the two things. Because what we just watched was somewhat connected. I mean, it's certainly made to connect, but not necessarily glued together in quite the same way. So what I mean by that is that we have someone playing an analog synthesizer, right? And they are maybe plugging some parameters into the visual element, but the two things are not totally inseparable, really. I don't think. I think that it's put together a little bit. Whereas with the Vasulkas, they're very interested in a real-time experience. And so there can be no post-production or anything like that. So I want to listen to a little bit of what their motivation and philosophy is. And this interview, they're older, and so they're very slow. So don't get bored, and we won't listen to it for that long. But we'll start watching this particular interview at about okay, so we'll start here at 8 minutes, and then we'll watch for about 4 minutes, then we'll skip to 32 minutes. There's a lot of talking. Okay, hit the pause button there. I will share the screen. Okay, so this is Woody and Steina Vasulka, and they're speaking about their history and why they did what they did. So I want to start at about right here.
Called, I forgot the name. But anyway, that was a 3-screen, a large screen, a movie. But then I stumbled over half-inch video, and it changed my life completely, because suddenly I understood. It is not the image, it's the material from which images are made. And it's the organization of that image that makes the difference. Because I couldn't face any Antonionis and Fellinis or all, because that was done. They made this, and I wasn't brave to compete with that and go to Hollywood and try to reinvent the world. But I saw this small piece of instrument that kind of I could own and put the rules on it and start from scratch. And this is what my generation was about. We could not be epigons anymore because it was done. The modern movement had changed the world. There was no way to sneak in another part of it, accept it. So that's how it all began. So instead of working with camera as primary deliverer of the sort of a symbolic thing, like an image, I went into looking into the instruments that would do alternate depiction of the world, which was waveform generators, mostly originated in audio synthesis. And then we built a lot of things that altered things, colorized things, restructured things. So the source was this kind of a material that was shaped differently, processed and depicted and meant something different. Of course, there always was part of it which was camera, but it was like a documenting of time and go through the gay theaters and rock and roll and all the what I call the American decadent period and the alternate culture of the youth culture that totally overshadowed the Hollywood interests and all. So we were integrated in that time.
Do you feel that the timeline that is derived from film, the slicing up of time, is the right way to deal? Sorry, this is very different. Yeah, I'll go with is the right way to deal with movement, because if you work with oscillators, you don't have to deal with slices of time, and it seems to me that's something you've done. You've played with that. So how do you feel about the constraints of the time slice?
So I have first my definition, and maybe you could criticize that. Anyway, film is about what happens between two frames, preceding and succeeding. That means between that, your perception makes the major processing. It has to connect or set up the meaning of the preceding with succeeding in a sense of what's called apparent motion. That is the kind of a result of this. And once you make a train of these images, you have sort of a continuous illusion of the motion, but still that is the apparatus that presents that phenomenology. Now, that means there is a shutter that's in the operation that separates this, and what's called the black in between is simply the very important thing for the after image that comes after. But all the processing in a mind has to be psychologically integrated. The same happens, of course, in video, but let's say when you use an oscillator or all the analog devices to do it, then you actually put in continuity of certain events that are not segmented, but they have to be the same way interpreted. But the mind deals it as a result the same, but they understand the alien world that comes from that type of abstraction.
Okay, so I'm sorry to not get Steina to talk there, but we're going to skip forward to 3230.
Or signal would go back in a kind of feedback. And these were the exciting things.
And talking about feedback, this was the gift of God. It started, of course, in electronic acoustics, but it also is just, of course, echo. Echo in the space is actually a feedback, and there were maybe a couple of painters that dealt with it in some strange way, like Franz Kupka and so. But this idea to have a system that feeds into itself, now we have that, of course, even in digital images, but we build a whole machine just to see the digital feedback faster and faster.
Okay, so I like that explanation of feedback being a gift from the gods. So if you've ever played with feedback, you know that it's interesting and pretty mysterious. Okay, so now I want to shift to Vasulka's work with the root etra synthesizer. And to do that, we will need to be introduced to the root etra synthesizer a little bit. So I'll let the video speak for itself here.
I'm Bill Etra, and this is the root etra video synthesizer. The synthesizer controls the height of an image the width of an image, the height and width of an image together to 0, which gives us a zoom, the intensity of an image, the horizontal screen position of an image off the screen in both directions, and the vertical position of an image off the screen in both directions. And one other parameter, which we call horizontal centering. As I put an effect into the image, you can see that horizontal centering allows us to move the image through the effect. When we use these controls in combination, we are able to animate the image.
I thought what I was going to do was build a tool and then everything would be perfect. And see, the first tool, the Radetra, was built and then found another problem, that something it didn't do, and the drive for the last few years has been to build something that will do anything imaginable. I'm very concerned with how the tools work and people's ability to use them. There are a lot of people who do not want to go into the detail of making the tools. There are very many guitarists who would not ever play the guitar if they had to make a guitar. I think that the tools that I build tend to lend temporal plasticity to the art. The ability to change things in time, fluidly, is what I'm aiming for.
All right, so to change things fluidly in time. Well, sounds like music. So what I'd like to do now is look at how the Vasulkas, who are probably the best known for their use of the Radetra synthesizer, use it. And what's interesting here, again, is their use of waveforms, for instance, as some sonic material, or it's rather as visual material. And so it's kind of interesting what they said, that those things have a meaning of their own that is not represented externally in the world, right? And so they're working sort of in this interesting artistic space that, in my opinion, is some of the most interesting space coming out. And they're probably best known for this 1974 piece called Noise Fields, which is a real hard thing to watch. Maybe we'll watch 30 seconds of it. Does anybody have epilepsy? If you do, don't watch this.
I'm about to find out.
Yeah, we're about to find out. So let's watch the Vasulkas, who I've spoken about already, and we watched a little interview of them. Let's watch a little bit of their. Actually, let's not. Let's skip Noise Fields. I'll let you watch that on your own, and instead we'll watch Transformations from 1978, which uses the Radetra synthesizer and gives you sort of the quintessential sort of Radetra synthesizer look. Let me find it here. Yeah. Okay. Share the screen. Okay, so this is Transformations. Okay, and I'm going to jump forward a little bit to get into it a bit. Okay, so that sort of look, it's a long piece, and I think there's better pieces that show a tighter integration, one of which is done quite recently. So Brian O'Reilly, who did the visuals for Curtis Rhodes' Point Light Cloud and his latest album as well, worked with Woody Vasulka in these scan processor studies. So even though these look really old, they're actually from 2009. So let's check those out. Sort of a hardcore noise music film that's pretty cool. So let's dial it up here first. And I'll share the screen. All right, and so on. So there we've definitely entered some alien world. The synthesis of the audio and visual is tightly related, of the same substance. It is truly avant-garde work for 2009 even, but using a synthesizer from the 70s. So it's pretty interesting stuff. So I wanted to dive back a little bit into time again and look at what Steina Vasulka has to say about how audio is used to control video sometimes in their work. And I think that for us, we can glean a lot from this little thing because we can imagine quite easily how we might apply it to what we're learning technically in jitter right now. So let's see. Let me find the right segment of video here. Yes. And I'll go ahead and share the screen.
Morphology. It can.
And my name is.
Then I was.
So we'll just jump ahead. Here's some of their other work at the time.
If you are in.
But I want to skip forward to this particular part.
Sculptures and none of that. But she could use the tones, like we had a synthesizer, audio synthesizer, and she immediately, after we entered this idea that the sound synthesizer can drive image, that's her leitmotif.
Yeah, but I'm glad you used the word sound. You could also say audio, sound or audio. It's not music. No. See, we don't use music. In order to be able to distort the image this way, I had to clean it up, filter it into a sine wave. And then I could make it to a complex sine wave, inverted sine wave. Looks a lot like Helga's scan. It is the sound of my bowing that is distorting the picture.
I'm kind of an opposite. I take sound out of the image because these two things become to us both the building material. This is the material of electronic sound and image.
Okay, so there you have it. That's what we're looking forward to, or what we're trying to do. It's kind of what they talk about, but maybe not in the same way that they do it. So I would be remiss if I did not talk about the influence of the Root-Etra synthesizer in popular culture. So let's listen to a piece of sort of, I'm not very familiar with my EDM styles, but it sounds kind of like techno to me. This is some popular music made with, the images are made with the Root-Etra synthesizer. And what I like is what they say about it to try to explain it to the YouTube audience. They say there's no real narrative except what you might create in your imagination. The inspirations are from avant-garde animation, such as Oscar Fischinger, and avant-garde video work from the 20th century, which we've just been looking at. We like to imagine an interdimensional being traveling from their dimension to ours via the gateway within the permanent hexagon-shaped storm cloud at Saturn's North Pole. Okay, so let's look at this piece of popular music that is trying to motivate us to think about Saturn's North Pole. And you will notice the Root-Etra synthesizer images right away, I think. Okay, so there you have it. I'm fairly sure that music is not meant to be listened to at 10:40 in the morning. Or maybe it is. What style of music is that? What is that?
Sounds like techno to me.
Techno.
Wow. Okay, so there's one last thing I want to hit upon, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff from the 70s that deals with this analog paradigm of mixing two things together. And it really is, looks forward to the digital world. But remember what I said before, that working in the digital world at this time is not nearly as cool looking. And we had that same experience with audio, where it's like, really, we're going to make music with a computer because it sounds terrible. Compared to what Stockhausen is doing in 1959, 1960 with tape and analog equipment. So here we kind of have the height of analog audiovisual art happening in the 70s before the 80s come along, and we have to move digital a little bit so that the aesthetic kind of changes, and it becomes pretty difficult for a while, but it's a transition that had to happen. But I want to highlight a couple other works, one by Vibeke Sorensen. So she is still going. She still works. I think she's probably still working in California. She was there when I was there and was part of the California Nanosystems Institute, where I worked as well. But she's been doing video art and music for a long time. So she does the music and the video. And this is a piece called Temple from 1976. And she uses the Rut Etra to create this work. So let's have another look and listen. Vibeke Sorensen, who we will talk about a little bit more next class as well. She went on to work at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in the video synthesis lab. Okay. Vibeke Sorensen, Temple.